Welcome back, everybody. So, what we're going to focus on in this particular lecture is the Oklahoma City bombing that occurred in 1995. And we're going to use this as a case study to really look into domestic terrorism and particularly far right extremism in the United States. And so, to do that, though, we need to first get a little bit of an overview of far right extremism in the United States. We've talked about this some, but really want to try to parse it out a little bit more. So it really does have an extensive history in the US. We can see this in various elements. We can see peak periods of far right terrorism in the US were in the 1870s with the emergence of groups like the Ku Klux Klan and White League in the American South. We saw a resurgence of these groups, especially in the 1910 to 1930 period. And then, as we've talked about, really in the present, we've seen an increase in terms of the number of groups and organizations that operate on the fringes of the right and really have carried out a number of attacks and become the most significant terrorist threat that the United States currently faces in many ways. And when we talk about the far right, though, we have to break it down into several categories. We've alluded to these in previous discussions, but I wanted to try to break them down a little bit more. So the first thing to emphasize is that these three categories, white supremacy, anti-government, motivated terrorists, and religious terrorists, they don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. There are lots of people who cross all three of these particular viewpoints and perspectives and belong to all three, but there are certain individuals who subscribe more to one variation than the other, so it's just important to keep that in mind. So white supremacy is fairly straightforward. It has a long history in the United States, going back to slavery and repression of Native Americans in the United States, and we really see white supremacist ideology having a long history in the United States, and especially in periods where minority groups have gained greater influence and control and had more moves towards greater equality, we see really a reemergence and reassertion of white supremacist terrorist groups. So we see this in the 1870s after the Civil War, when African Americans are protected by Union troops during Reconstruction for a period of time. There's an expansion of African American enfranchisement. We have the first individuals who are African American to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives from the American South. So we see a backlash to this expansion of African American rights during the 1870s. We see this again, particularly in the late 1970s, 1980s, in response to the civil rights movement and the increase in far right extremists during this point as well. And then we see another spike of resurgence again post 2008 with the election of President Barack Obama in response to the election of the first African American president. So a lot of these things have been linked, and a lot of these moments where there are perceived increases in equality and expansion of rights for minorities, white supremacist groups tend to spike around those particular periods of time. And we also have the anti-government variety of anti-government variety of right-wing terrorists. And we see this in, if you've ever heard of groups called sovereign citizens, people like this, who really see the federal government and federal government power as an extensive overreach of what they should be doing. And we see this in particular out west. As I recommended in the previous lecture, the podcast Bundyville, which focuses on the family of the Bundys who live in Utah. Here we see a lot of individuals and groups that are functioning that really see any sort of federal government involvement, especially federal government ownership of land, especially ranching lands, as really a overstepping of federal government power. And a lot of these individuals really want to see really an end to the federal government, and they have extensively targeted and been willing to kill especially federal law enforcement agents such as the FBI, Bureau of Land Management, alcohol, tobacco, firearms. All these groups, all these organizations, these anti-government groups see as the ultimate enemy that's looking to infringe upon their sovereignty and instill a sort of dictatorship that prevents them from doing whatever it is that they want to do. And then finally, we have this religious variant in terms of far right extremism in the United States, Christian identity terrorism. And we see this with groups like the Army of God. And these groups really started to pick up, especially and gain a lot of traction after Roe v. Wade and the expansion of abortion rights for women. And these were seen, these groups on the extreme would target, they would kill doctors who carried out abortion. They'd be willing to blow, and they have blown up abortion clinics, target groups like Planned Parenthood. These religious Christian identity groups really fit into this far right extremist vein as well. And so, again, as I said, a lot of people straddle these three different categories, but they can be their own separate entities as well. So, what do we notice in terms of trends in far right extremist incidents? So, this is a graph from BBC showing the number of far right extremist incidents in North America. And as we focus just on the US in the last class, Western Europe has experienced an increase in far right extremist violence as well in expansion, especially after the 2000s. In the last 10 years as well, there's been an increase in far right extremist movements. But here we can see, based on the red bars, an gradual increase and significant increase in the number of far right incidents in both North America, predominantly the United States, some in Canada, but also in Western Europe. And we can see that really no region of the United States is immune from these particular incidents. We see them happening all over the United States. We see them particularly out west. We see them, this is often the case where we have lots of conflict, especially between these anti-government groups and anti-government groups and federal law enforcement agencies over the federal government's management of especially ranching land. So we see these far right attacks as well in the South, where we see a lot more racial incidents as well. So we see really the capacity for these far right terrorist incidents to occur all over the United States. No area is particularly immune from these particular types of attacks. So, as I said, for this class, I want to focus and talk about the Oklahoma City bombing. And the Oklahoma City bombing is carried out essentially by Timothy McVeigh alone. He had a little bit of help, but Timothy McVeigh was truly the mastermind and the individual behind the Oklahoma City bombing, which prior to the 9/11 attack was the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil. It occurs in 1995. And Timothy McVeigh, like some of these other right-wing terrorists that we've talked about, guys like Anders Behring Breivik, we did a case study of, really began radicalizing at an early age. Had a lot of difficulties in school, difficult childhood, and really seemed to transfer these experiences into his radicalization into far-right extremism. And he joined the Army in the late 1980s and served in the Army during the first Iraq War, and some writings and some reportings have said that he was extremely excited to go to the Middle East because he wanted to kill Arabs. He was already demonstrating a particularly virulent strain of certain white supremacist aspects. He got in trouble with the military numerous times for having a number of racial incidents with individuals who he served with. Timothy McVeigh, I believe, achieved the rank of sergeant and had a lot of complaints filed against him by African American soldiers who served under his command. So he had demonstrated a pretty early history, even in the late 1980s, early 1990s, before he engaged and really fully radicalized with having a particular strain of white supremacy in his thinking. And then after he left the military in 1991, he really really fully started to radicalize to an extent where he was going to be willing to engage in an attack and wanted to undertake action against the government. And so, in this sense, he really did start to adopt the views of all three categories of far right extremism. He had elements of white supremacy already starting to form at an early age prior to his traveling around the US and meeting extremist groups between 1991 and 1995. So we had that element of white supremacy and then met with lots of these groups, and this helped solidify his white supremacist ideology. He started to see the US government as the enemy and saw them as the oppressor of American society. And he had a lot of inspiration in this particular vein, well, and as well as the white supremacist ideology, from reading a book called The Turner Diaries. And The Turner Diaries is a book that was written and is one of the most popular works of fiction in the far right literature that essentially lays out a fictional story of a essentially several things happen. There's a race war that has occurred that ends up with minorities in the United States gaining power and suppressing white Americans, as well as the overreach of the federal government to take away the guns of Americans and the Second Amendment and prevent white people from bearing arms. And in this fictionalized extremist account, this really did play a major role in inspiring a lot of people, not even just Timothy McVeigh. This book is still extremely popular on the right today. And I have not actually read it, read the summary on Wikipedia, but it sounds like one of the most vile pieces of fiction you could actually read. But it's important to know about because it has played an important role in inspiring a lot of individuals who subscribe to these various far right ideologies, as it does cut across all three groups: white supremacist groups, anti-government, and religious elements that are in the book. And so Timothy McVeigh reaches a point, especially after a couple incidents that we haven't talked about so far. There are two major incidents that were argued in the 1990s to have led to the inspiration of far-right attacks, as especially Timothy McVeigh's, with the government's what was perceived as government overreach and government overuse of force in two places, one called Ruby Ridge and one called Waco. And Ruby Ridge was an incident that occurred where alcohol, tobacco, firearms went to, I believe, confiscate the weapons of an individual who was collecting illegal firearms. The standoff went poorly, and the individuals who lived at Ruby Ridge ended up being killed in a shootout with alcohol, tobacco, firearms. And then another incident, which if you want to watch a dramatized account, it's just been turned into a movie on Netflix, and that is the incident in Waco in the early 1990s. I believe 1993 or 1994 is when Waco occurs. And Waco is an incident where there is a standoff between a religious cult called the Branch Davidians and the FBI and alcohol, tobacco, firearms. What this group of individuals were living on a particular compound in Texas, and it was discovered that they were stockpiling weapons and illegal weapons such as hand grenades. And so there was a standoff with the FBI and alcohol, tobacco, firearms that lasted many days, and ultimately there was a fire that broke out at the compound, killing a huge number of people of the Branch Davidians. And this was really seen by a lot of people on the far right as being caused by the federal government and federal government overreach. And so Timothy McVeigh actually went and camped out and observed the standoff at Waco. And this, again, also played into and fit into his view of federal government overreach in American lives. And all of these things really helped ultimately lead him to carrying out the Oklahoma City bombing. And this is a picture of the Oklahoma City bombing, which occurred on April 19th, 1995. So this year actually celebrated the 25th anniversary and commemorated the 25th anniversary of the attack. And in the attack, 168 people were killed, 684 injured. And of the 168 people who were killed, 19 were children. And the building that he chose to blow up was the federal building in Oklahoma City, because, as we said, he had developed this virulent strain of anti-government ideology, and striking at the U.S. federal building in Oklahoma City was seen as a symbolic attack. And he thought that this could be a fulfillment of, to some extent, a fulfillment and a playing out in real life of some of the incidents that happened in the Turner Diaries. That his carrying out the Oklahoma City bombing would bring about this revolution for white supremacist groups and anti-government groups, religious groups, to take up arms to overthrow the oppressive federal government, maintain a racial hierarchy, institute a mandated Christian religion in the United States, and really bring about the changes he wanted to achieve. Although none of these things actually happened, it did go down, as I said, as the deadliest U.S. terrorist attack before 9/11, and really was seen as an inspiration, and still is, by a lot of groups today. And so when we think about this, we have to think about his legacy. And we really think about that we have seen a real significant resurgence, especially in the last decade, of far-right terrorism and what that means. And many of them view Timothy McVeigh as a hero. They see him truly as an inspiration for what they think could be possible to bring about their radical revolution and change to the United States. And so I'll just leave it there for my final comments on the case study, and I'll leave you with your final discussion question. And that is, why didn't the Oklahoma City bombing change the U.S. in the same way 9/11 did? Again, why didn't the Oklahoma City bombing change the United States in the same way 9/11 did? We talked about all the ways that 9/11 has changed society, so it's important to think about why Oklahoma City might not have had the same effect. I'll leave it there for today. Thanks so much for listening.